and I'm يعني I just can't, I don't know, I wouldn't know where to start. I'm going to say the one and only Professor Heba Handousa, currently Managing Director of ENID, Egypt Network for Integrated Development, founder of ERF, and first Managing Director for the first 10 years, and our mentor and inspirational guide to many of us who are here online and playing a leading role in very key positions. Professor Heba Handousa, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. Our speakers, one of them is here, Tamara.
They're online. Both are online.
Both? I have
They're
three
both online.
names. اللي هم زينة وجيدو. Hello. And so we're honored to have speakers. Zena Nama. Hello, Zena. Tamara
To see you,
Kool.
Doctor.
Sorry?
I said it's very good to see you.
Very good to see you.
Thank you. And Guido Heinz. Guido?
Unfortunately, Guido can't join us.
We also have commentators both online and right next to me. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Vladimir Hlasny from UN ESQA in Beirut.
All right, Alexis Luchinsky, the World Bank, Washington, D.C. I work on the social insurance and social protection policies in the region.
Excellent. So we can start on time. And I think our first speaker will be Zena.
Tamara will give
Heba.
the presentation, and then I will move to the discussions. So I'm going to give the floor to Tamara.
Okay.
And Dr.
Tamara?
Heba, there's also Luca, who's online.
Luca?
Luca, yes. If you'd like to give him the chance to introduce
Luca?
himself.
Hello.
Yes. Very good afternoon, everyone.
I'm
This is
sorry,
Luca.
I didn't read out your name.
No worries. I'm Luca Pellerano. I'm the regional social protection specialist with the International Labour Organization, working on matters of social insurance across the Arab region. I'm based in the Beirut office and joining you from Beirut this afternoon. Thank you.
Excellent. I'm trying to be in touch with ILO because we're going to be doing a lot of work in the south of Egypt, where I've been for 12 years. And, you know, Upper Egypt is the poorest part of Egypt. And I think I'll have a lot to learn from this session. But hope we can stay in touch beyond the session. So if we start with Tamara presenting.
Yes, very much. Let me open my slides briefly. So are you seeing the right slides? Okay, wait, yes, you should see it now. Is that correct?
Perfect.
Yeah, okay, perfect. Thank you so much. We've had the pleasure of attending the workshops for the past 2 days. They have been quite interesting and led to a lot of discussions on social protection in Egypt, Jordan, and Tunisia. And indeed, exchanging knowledge and sharing practices is important. We argue amongst that others in the paper. But we now have the challenge of bringing it all together and bringing you a comparative paper where we look at social insurance from a more regional perspective, comparing the situation in Egypt, Jordan, and Tunisia. Now, we know that political regimes, economic policies, and societal aspirations have in part shaped social contracts over time. However, recent challenges like the political instability, economic disparities, COVID-19 and the social unrest have raised concerns about the sustainability of these social contracts. So in the paper, we argue that strengthening contributory social insurance schemes can serve as a potential solution for strengthening the social contract. This requires a further insight into the de jure and the de facto insurance coverage for different societal groups. So we aim to come to a better understanding of this through a mapping of the contributory social insurance schemes in the 3 countries and conducting an analysis of the integrated labor market panel survey using the most recent data available for each country. So in this case, that would be 2014 for Tunisia, 2016 for Jordan, and 2018 for Egypt. Now, over the past decade, Egypt, Jordan, and Tunisia have witnessed significant economic and labor market challenges. Like many other countries, the 3 countries have been grappling with conflicts, COVID-19, and climate shocks, resulting in slower GDP per capita growth. Next, the labor force participation rates have also fluctuated, with Egypt experiencing a decline since 2013, while Jordan and Tunisia having remained relatively stable, though we do note that the data highlights that gender disparities in labor force participation rates continue to persist, in part due to social norms, discrimination, and working conditions. These challenges are intricately intertwined with economic, fiscal, and demographic factors, and set the stage for an analysis of social protection systems' inclusivity and effectiveness across different societal groups in the 3 countries. We therefore looked at the legal framework and the institutions governing contributory social insurance in Egypt, Jordan, and Tunisia. The 3 countries showcase contrasting approaches to social insurance coverage. As the table also highlights, old age pension, survivor's pension, maternity benefit, and work injury benefit are prevalent in one form or another in all 3 countries. Yet while Tunisia has a rather comprehensive system in place, Jordan and Egypt rather differ, with certain schemes being included and others not. This already highlights the diverging approaches between the different countries. Now, to better understand which different groups are able to access social insurance, we looked at whom are covered from a mandatory and a voluntary perspective. And within the mandatory coverage, we further distinguish between full coverage and partial coverage. We find that in Egypt, social insurance follows a mandatory framework that encompasses a broad range of workers that covers employees in both the public and private sectors. Its mandatory coverage extends to most formal sector employees, providing them with essential benefits and security. In contrast, Jordan's approach to social insurance features a combination of mandatory and voluntary coverage, where the latter is available for self-employed individuals and workers in specific sectors who can opt in to the social security system and access benefits. Tunisia, on the other hand, has a social insurance system in place that primarily relies on mandatory coverage. The CNSS, the CNRPS, and the CNAM administer the mandatory scheme, encompassing employees in both the public and private sector. As emerges from the mapping, all 3 countries have certain exclusions within their social insurance systems. Commonly excluded groups include economic activities in the informal sector, domestic workers, and low-wage workers. Many of the otherwise vulnerable groups at risk of being left out seem to be included to a large extent in the context of Tunisia. However, what also emerges from the mapping is that in Egypt and Jordan, the included groups largely have access to the same type of schemes, whereas in Tunisia, these are primarily the old age pension, survivor's pension, and disability pension, and to a lesser extent, death benefits that are available for all type of employees. The legislative framework in place is thus cognizant of the importance of social insurance in promoting social welfare and economic instability. Nonetheless, the analysis above also illustrates that gaps and fragmentation may occur. To understand to what extent the different societal groups have access, we looked at the recent data for each country. Here we used the variable whether someone has contributed to work insurance in the past 3 months. In Egypt, 37% of reported being enrolled in the social insurance schemes, while 41.3% in Jordan and 49.2% in Tunisia. The figure further sets the percentage of worker by sector, the percentage of social insurance coverage, and the percentage of private sector workers, and the percentage of employed by 6 main sectors of economic activity for each country. It shows a strong connection between the share of private employment, which is the size of the bubble, and social insurance coverage on the horizontal axis. Indeed, activities characterized by public sector jobs and the public sector itself, such as education and public administration, increase the likelihood of being insured for employees. Similarly, the manufacturing industry also displays highest shares of insured in all 3 countries, in particular in Tunisia. Agriculture, on the other hand, which is the largest sector in Egypt and Tunisia, but Egypt and Tunisia has a lower coverage share than all other countries. My apologies, that should be Jordan, by the way, Egypt and Jordan. Nonetheless, Tunisia achieved a marginal coverage of workers in the sector, which is compared to Jordan and Egypt, where the extremely low coverage affects the overall number of social insured in the country. Overall, between 63 and 79% of those with contracts in the private sector are insured. When we look at the likelihood that workers in specific sectors are insured, we find that someone working in the government sector in Egypt is 4 times likely to be insured compared to someone in the private sector. Similarly, for public enterprises, for Jordan, the likelihood might be lower, but it's still higher for government public enterprise workers compared to private sector workers. For Tunisia, this finding only holds for public enterprise workers. Next, when looking at income, we find that there is generally a higher share of insured in higher quintiles of the wage distribution, except the coverage is only marginally decreasing in Jordan and Egypt for the highest quintile. As mentioned before, there is a gender disparity at hand taking place in the labor market. We therefore also looked at the gender component, and we find that Tunisia has proportionally more women in the labor force among the 3 countries, with 26% of women participating in 2017, whereas Jordan continues to be characterized by a low female level of female labor force participation. Further, women are disproportionately less present in high-level employee private sector jobs and overall have lower wages. Of those women employed, about 1/3 lack a contract. Further, the share of women among individuals without insurance equals 60.7% in Egypt, 24.4% in Tunisia, and in Jordan only 6.5%, although, as we also argue, this is driven by the low female labor force participation rate. The sector matters. Women in Egypt and Jordan are working primarily in government and public enterprises when compared to the distribution of the overall labor force. In Tunisia, on the other hand, employed women have a similar distribution of employment in the public sector when compared to the overall labor force. At the same time, the social insurance incidence shows that women in Egypt and Jordan has a higher likelihood of being insured when employed. This links back to the odds ratio presented in the previous slide. In Tunisia, there is a more inclusive labor force participation rate with a higher share of women working in multiple sectors, and as such, they face slightly lower social insurance coverage compared to men. The analysis above provides an initial overview of the interconnection between the labor market, access to social insurance, and effective social insurance coverage. Several similarities and differences can be observed. On the level of similarities, we find the following of relevance. Labor market composition, where in all three countries, employees in the formal sector, particularly wage employees, are more likely to participate in the social insurance system, though we do observe that gender disparities are present. On the side of barriers to coverage, we find that informality, irregular employment, and lack of awareness contribute to disparities in social insurance coverage in all three countries. Lastly, when contrasting de jure and de facto coverage, disparities emerge between the de jure, or those legally mandated, and the de facto coverage. What is the actual coverage on the ground? As for differences, these include the structure of social insurance systems, as presented earlier. Similarly, while disparities in social insurance coverage between the public and private sector exist in all three countries, these may be influenced differently by varying resources, levels of incomes, and capacities of employers. In addition, it is imperative to acknowledge the broader micro and micro level challenges that influence these systems. So, while all three countries should prioritize policies aimed at bridging the gap between the theoretical and the actual coverage, still lessons can be drawn from each country. Each year provides an insight into the potential of adopting a mandatory framework for a comprehensive coverage that encompasses a wide spectrum of workers across public and private sectors. The emphasis on mandatory contributions from both employers and employees has the potential to yield extensive coverage and a robust safety net against diverse risks. Jordan, on the other hand, highlights a blended approach to mandatory and voluntary coverage for self-employed, as it extends provisions for self-employed individuals and specific sectors to voluntarily participate in the social insurance system, and can narrow gaps in coverage within this informal sector. Lastly, Tunisia's prioritization of mandatory participation as a primary means to achieve widespread societal coverage offers valuable insights to construct a more comprehensive and inclusive social insurance system. So to conclude, we find that within the context of these countries, the social contracts have undergone transformations in response to evolving societal needs and aspirations. Nevertheless, the challenge of sustaining socially equitable systems amid political turbulence, economic disparities, and social unrest looms large. The existence of gaps in social insurance coverage not only reinforce prevailing inequalities, but may also amplify the vulnerabilities experienced by marginalized segments of society, in particularly those engaged as domestic workers, self-employed, or those in small-scale agricultural companies. This gives rise to concerns about the fairness and inclusivity of the social contract, which should ideally ensure equal access and protection for all individuals, regardless of their employment status or societal belonging. We therefore developed a multitude of policy recommendations that could inform the way forward to re-strengthen the social contract. With an eye on time, I will not go into all, but I will briefly focus on those aimed at national government and regional level. As highlighted earlier today, an integrated approach needs to be taken when it comes to strengthening national social protection systems. On the side of social protection design, we argue for the importance for Egypt, Jordan, and Tunisia to embark on a comprehensive policy reform to expand coverage to vulnerable and informal sector workers, and which addresses the disparities between sectors and societal groups. Efforts should be directed towards strengthening social protection mechanisms within these countries and build capacity. Within this tripartite approach, involving employers, people, and government, can foster a more participatory approach. Moreover, on the side of the larger economic structure, government should prioritize sustainable resource allocation to bolster social insurance system. Financial resources must be allocated judiciously to ensure the fiscal sustainability of social insurance schemes while extending their coverage. In addition, we need to critically examine and adjust the existing labor market policies with an eye on the informal market, sectoral variations, and economic transitions. On a more regional level, we are making a start. We are here together today. It is important to share knowledge and best practices, and this can yield valuable insights into improving social insurance coverage. In addition, cooperative approaches such as harmonizing policies on common challenges to promote more consistent social protection across borders could be explored. Lastly, advocacy initiatives could be jointly pursued to actively engage external stakeholders, including international donors and organizations, in championing social insurance policies that are closely aligned with the objectives of the social contract within Egypt, Jordan, and Tunisia. With that, I would like to conclude my presentation and thank you for the time. I will give the floor now back to Heba.
Thank you very much, Tamara. And you have as many as 3 discussants. So we're going to give, I think, 10 minutes to each, starting with Vladimir.
First, do you want to ask if Zeina has any?
I thought Zeina was also a discussant, no?
Oh, I will. I'm for the discussion portion. So as part of the authors, I will answer questions. But I think you also have Luca online as a discussant. That's why you're 3.
Please go ahead.
Okay. Thank you so much for. Can you hear me well? Okay. So thank you so much for the very rich paper and very nice presentation. Actually, the paper is very rich, and there are maybe kind of 4 dimensions to the paper. One, kind of the static overview of policies across the 3 countries, and it's complete enough. It's that there are tables in the text and in the appendix, and the nice summary that Tamara showed. So it's a comprehensive review of the provisions under the 3 countries' social insurance system, and that's a paper on its own. And then there is a discussion of the macroeconomic situation over the past decade in the 3 countries, and linking to the evolution of social insurance, and that's also very interesting. And then the 2 other dimensions have to do with the data used, the labor market panel surveys. One, just kind of supporting the conceptual findings with descriptive statistics from the data, and which is done successfully. And finally, kind of a small, I wish there was, the last part was expanded, is the statistical analysis of the drivers of social insurance coverage, which there's a short section in the paper on that, but that's the one part that I think could be expanded. So very rich paper, and in fact, I would think that it's at least 2 papers or maybe 3 papers in one. And the paper is all sections of the paper have to do with the disparity between the de jure versus de facto coverage by social insurance, and that gets the reader thinking while reading about what could be happening, especially the paper finds that there's this huge disparity in Egypt, then maybe slightly lower disparity in Jordan, and then much smaller, I think, disparity, if that's my interpretation is correct, in Tunisia. And my comments on the paper have to do with the discussion that we had yesterday in the conference on the issue of choice of workers opting into social insurance, and that I think could be discussed a little bit more in the paper. In fact, maybe there's a discussion between the de jure versus de facto coverage. Maybe another layer is needed something like the opto coverage, what the workers opt in or opt out of social insurance, and what we optically observe in the data, because when we think of de jure coverage, there are legal barriers. So the state decides who is covered, who is not, and that could be done at the national level or maybe at the sectoral level. Then the de facto coverage, we could think of it as taking place at the level of sectors or at the level of individual firms. Let's say employers with certain power or with some pressures, competitive pressures, may offer coverage to all of their workers or just some of their workers, and maybe the workers have limited play in that choice. And then the last one, the choice of the workers, that's that has to, so to me the de facto coverage is a function of these employer power, employer competitive effects, and also maybe information barriers to workers, and the kind of the red tape, the registration process of getting into coverage. But I think lastly, yesterday we talked about the preference barriers or the personal cost of participation, and we discussed how important that could be. That when we think of social insurance, what does it protect from, and what does it achieve for workers, and how does social insurance help young male workers on the marriage market or with their migration aspirations. So in the region, if the workers have other needs and preferences than just labor market stability, and if they're myopic and they don't think of their old age pensions currently, they might opt out of being covered presently through their employment. And yesterday we also discussed that social insurance through employment is just one source of protection in the region. Workers are protected through their family members, also through their past employment spells. So workers may not have to be protected by their current employment if they have already locked in some benefits through other means, private sector, family members, past employment, and so on. So that's so with these, sounds good. With these considerations, as I was looking at the descriptive statistics and the regression results, made me think that the analysis needs to be done at several levels of disaggregation. Some choices are made at the maybe national or sectoral level. Some choices, maybe the de facto coverage is done at the level of firms, probably mostly, and and only perhaps the worker's individual choice over occupation and over being covered is done at the individual level. So perhaps the analysis needs to be done in some stacked way to take into account these different decisions being made. I have some technical feedback on the statistical analysis, which I will share with authors. I don't have to go over them now. Maybe the last thought. I think so. Given and the last thing I will say, that the labor market panel surveys are being used just one. They give a kind of a spotlight on just one point in time in each of the three countries, right? 2018 in Egypt, 2014 Tunisia, 2016 Jordan, when the countries had a different macroeconomic situation, and as we heard yesterday, the social insurance was being reformed at the time. So these points could be before, during, or after reforms. And so I think the results need to be interpreted. So I view it as a little bit of a disconnect. The national description of the laws and macroeconomic situation, and then we go into stylized facts from labor market panel surveys, and they could be brought together a little bit, saying explicitly which point in time these LMPSs refer to in that development path. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Vladimir. And Vladimir, I forgot to say with the UN ESQA, and I think we have a lot of good people, including some students of mine at the helm. Now we're going to listen to the comments from Leslie
Sluchinsky. Thank you.
Introduce yourself.
All right, I'll do senior economist with the World Bank. Thank you for inviting me to provide these comments today. I agree with you, Vladimir, that it's actually the paper that packs a lot of interesting information, perhaps even deserving to be two different pieces in terms of the topics and the areas that it covers. But it makes it actually interesting. I mean, there's a lot of country-specific studies in Egypt, Tunisia, Jordan that I've seen produced by my colleagues at the World Bank, by some of the research teams in each of countries, specifically in Egypt. Actually, there is a strong research community looking at the issues of coverage. And it's quite exciting to see, because I think as a matter of national policy, it's certainly increasing in priority to expand the coverage to otherwise uncovered population, or the missing middle, as we say, which is there are people who cannot afford, the families who cannot afford any coverage, so they stay in the social assistance and then wage workers. But then there's a big gap in between, and it varies in time, by industry, with a gender, age, just like the paper presents. In fact, I like this aspect of the paper, which looks at the relative importance of different factors that explain the level of participation. It's not always a choice. It's also the function of administration, right? And so from that perspective, I don't think there is, any of the comments that I can make will should be taken as the recommendation to change anything in the paper. I think the paper itself is, as I said, fairly rich, consistent, and coherent. It's more of what's outside. So if you go outside of scope of this paper, what are the other issues that could be looked at? So I have several categories there. And I think one would be, and it's a big message to start with, engage with the agencies. All right. So there's a lot of information in the administrative data. Unfortunately, the agencies themselves, and it's my experience of working in both Jordan and Egypt. I haven't worked in Tunisia, but I reviewed some literature related to the two agencies that operate there. So the agencies themselves don't necessarily have capacity, institutional capacity, to ask the right questions, or even bandwidth to dive into these issues of the coverage and why and how. They do see importance of expanding the coverage, and part of it is coming just with a broader political agenda of the political leadership at the highest level. But then when it gets to the implementation, on one hand, there's a lot of data. On the other hand, connecting this data to some policy making that's lacking. And so when we talk about the data, a couple of things. So usually when we do the analysis of that sort, using the administrative data, we look at so-called contribution densities. So somewhat limitations of the research that we have here is that it's like a spot analysis, right? So you look at one point at a time. You really don't see how how the depth of this engagement with the agency affects the pension rights eventually. So one of the particular indicators is that, as I said, frequency of participation or density of contributions is, when we look at the spectrum of how frequently workers in certain industries or sectors participate. But then to summarize this number, or actually they integrate that number throughout the time, the useful indicator would be, which to me is always telling, is that average service at retirement. And this is extremely useful and telling indicator, usually by age. So when you have a retiring individual with all this effort, with all this participation, being in and out and looking after the child, joining later, studying and all this stuff, one number that summarizes all, it's your average service when you retire. And so if you look at the region in all these three countries, most of the time, that would be somewhere around 25 years. Again, depending on the sector, on your gender, so on whether it's a public or private, I've seen the numbers. I think it was even in Egypt. So some majority of the people would retire the service around 20 years. Or even 25 years. So what does it tell you? It means that half of their productive career, ages, they are outside of the system anyways, with all these numbers was a spot. And so interesting what happens there. The generosity, and that's another elephant in the room, generosity of all these schemes, meaning that they're fairly generous by international standard. It's not the aspect which is studied here, but, many other studies looked at this, is that you generally get out from the system more than you put in. Maybe that's the way to summarize it. And so the generosity of this system is sort of both a blessing and the curse. Blessing in the way that even with such a relatively short service, and by the way, for comparison, what I define as adequate participation is not less than 30 years when you retire. 30, 35 ideally. 20, 25 is way too low. So, but what happens is that if it's a generous scheme, then essentially even with the 20, 25 years, you have fairly high pensions with so-called replacement rate of 40, 45%, 50%, which is fairly good by standards of many countries. So in a way, you're masking that problem in the end. But the curse, of course, is that the more, and that this is, to me, one of the major faulty sort of inspiration for coverage expansion is that, let's focus on the coverage. I've seen it actually in some of these countries in the region, is that, the coverage expansion will contribute to improving of the fiscal situation. I think on one hand, you think, yeah, that makes sense. So the more people contributing, the better the fiscal is. But the problem is that since your system is generous and it's not sustainable in a way, the greater number of people are joining today with the unbalanced system, the greater the burden. You're just shifting the burden to the future generations. So it's not necessarily something that would be, help you solve your problems in an efficient way. So you need to work, in parallel, both on the system design, which is generosity aspect, and system coverage. Now that's one sort of area to build on. Of course, administration itself, I had the discussion with the colleague here before, is that it's important to look at how systems are administered, like how advanced and modern tools of monitoring, enforcement, and the follow-up are being used and applied in all these countries. Because studies by IMF, for example, they are focused on administration on the revenue side. They indicate that it's less the various policy parameters and then more on how you administer the system that affects your outreach and affects your coverage outcomes. Now, I'm moving to another group of the issues is why pensions? Like we are jumping, I'm being a little bit sort of devil's advocate that, maybe it's not the first, area that we should be jumping in and advocating for importance. There are a variety of the short-term risks. There is a health insurance as an elephant in the room. So I would say you perhaps can live without the pension coverage, perhaps, but you cannot live without the health coverage, without the health insurance. And so as a major reform happening in this country, the rollout of the health insurance, let's look at what's happening there. Can we compare the health insurance with the pension insurance coverage, for example, in Tunisia, where the health insurance, or in Jordan, well, the health insurance has been in place for some time. So in fact, now then related to this paper, let's differentiate in what we call coverage. So somehow we call contributory coverage and we mean everything, pensions, short-term, health, but let's actually differentiate and let's see how different programs have different impact in life, in the outreach. And as I said, maybe our gears should be shifted and importance on some other risks should be first prioritized. Pensions are just very, very, very expensive. That's a fact of life. And that could be, with administration and everything else, that could be the major factor that inhibits any effort of the outreach, because someone has to pay and pay a lot, whether it's employee or the employer or the government. It's a deferred consumption. It may be a luxury for a lot to pay for the deferred consumption. They don't have enough to consume today. So so what I would do actually, very good, thank you. So what I would encourage is let's look actually on the demand side. Let's ask those people who don't participate or participate part-time, full-time, what do they want? What do they need? Maybe they actually much more interested in the unemployment insurance, maternity benefit, sickness insurance. So all type of insurances that address the risks of losing the job temporarily or permanently versus pensions, health. So again, let's differentiate in this story of the coverage. And finally, on the recommendation, and that sort of logical conclusion, I hope, of what I was just said. So one way or the other, these costs need to be covered. And the government plays, and the budget plays an important role in providing the subsidy. And there's a separate literature on pensions specifically, not only pensions, other benefits, is that if the government is to step in and provide the subsidy, where the subsidy should be the most effective? It can be pre-pension, which is so-called co-contribution. So basically co-financing. So you put £1 and I as a government put another £1. And then what should be the ratio? It's 50-50 or something else. That's one. Or the post-retirement subsidy, which is, then it's a discussion of universality. And then maybe you forget about the idealism of contributory programs for certain sectors. Maybe you focus your effort on the universal benefit at some point. Maybe it's a high age, maybe it's a low benefit, but to start there. And I think these trade-offs, especially in the countries where the coverage gaps is so huge, they are really important to look at. Or maybe some sort of combination. You do both, but then you have a fixed and limited budget and you need to think how you split this between the subsidy of the contribution at the productive age and the subsidy at the age of retirement. So I think to conclude, maybe I should say the art of the policy of the coverage expansion in my way is that how most effectively, creatively, and innovatively to use the public subsidy to contribute to this goal. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our authors are lucky enough to have a third contribution from Dr. Luca Pellerano.
Yes, thank you very much. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Can you hear me all right?
I hope they've left something for you to tell us.
I'll try my best, but no, thank you. Thank you, and thanks for the invitation, and thank you to the authors for this very insightful work. I think that the cross-regional perspective is really cross-country perspective is really important, and the analysis really sheds light also on how important it is to kind of contrast and mirror issues to do with de facto coverage with also the de jure coverage, and really try to understand the relationship therein. I think it's a very interesting, as well as the multivariate analysis that you have attempted, and also trying to dissect what is the marginal contribution, if you want, of different factors in moving the needle in terms of social insurance coverage. I believe more of this work, and perhaps more of this work that takes exactly this regional perspective, is needed. Just a few comments from my side and from the ILO. I mean, first, I think the focus on de jure legal coverage, I think, is very important, and one immediately realizes the kind of the range of different legal approaches that have been taken across the region. You compare 3 countries, and really the legal regimes when it comes to social insurance are quite some different there. Also, they look quite complex, and one can quite immediately see that there are, in a way, legal coverage loopholes that in a way prevent us to be able to simply say that each worker has a right to social security. I mean, there seems to be important segments of the working population who for some reason don't enjoy a full right to social security, and especially when it comes, for example, to the self-employed, to domestic workers, to the agriculture sector, there are really quite some stark differences there, although they do not necessarily translate into changes in effective coverage, which I think is an interesting finding of the paper. I was particularly interested in maybe you commenting a bit more as to what, from your perspective, explain the difference in legal coverage between Tunisia and Egypt, 2 countries I don't know very well, but where, I mean, when you read at your analysis, it appears as if de jure coverage in Tunisia has advanced quite significant, looks quite extensive. Yet your de jure sort of coverage estimate is significantly lower than Egypt. So maybe you can give us some insights as to what drives that difference, because Tunisia is sometimes seen as a country who has made important progress in terms of extending the jure coverage. A second comment, I think, on an analysis is really this notion of wage employed. I mean, you sometimes sort of isolate the wage employed, the employees in your analysis, and that group is often considered like an homogeneous group, but it in fact is not. I mean, even those who are formally wage employed, we know that there are quite some important differences in terms of contractual status and also entitlement to social protection. I'm thinking here of the fact that part-time workers are not covered. Formal wage part-time workers are not covered under many legislations in the region. I'm thinking here about also the seasonal or the worker on a more temporary time-bound contracts which are not always clearly covered under all legislation. So there has been, if you want, a process of precarization or a non-standardization of standard terms of wage employment, which I think would warrant perhaps some more analysis and insight. And case in point is a 16 days rule in Jordan, which makes it that anybody who has just a contract for 17 days a month is not considered a formal worker. Final point, I think, in terms of the kind of the methodology, is really maybe some comments on the issue of nationality. We know that nationality is a strong driver of coverage, not perhaps in primary terms, but in a secondary terms as a result of strong association of foreign migrant work with certain, the most vulnerable, sometimes precarious forms of employment. So did you deliberately decide to exclude sort of a nationality variable in the analysis, and what can you draw on that matter? So this, as per I think the paper, its value, and some methodological comments. Now, I just want to spend 2 more minutes to say something about what to make of the paper, what to make of this discussion, how to take it from here. And one remains somewhat wondering, as perhaps there is an urge for all of us to perhaps push the recommendations a little bit more to be more actionable. I'm not talking about this study in particular, but sort of those of us who work in this field. And I mean, what I take home from the paper is that there's been a discussion years back, you know, the end of social insurance. Do we need to let go of social insurance? Is it an obsolete concept that is kind of superseded by the nature of times and by the new labor market realities we're living in? And I think your paper confirms that, to the contrary, there needs to be more focus on social insurance. If not so, for the fact that we know that social insurance is in many countries the biggest contributors in terms of different subcomponents of social protection systems to poverty reduction. If you take away social insurance, the negative impact on poverty is much larger than if you take away many of the, if you want, social assistance schemes. And second, I think one other finding of your paper is that consistently wage employed workers in the poorest deciles are less covered. So if we manage to find a way around giving access to social insurance, especially to poor wage employed, the impact on poverty would be great. And finally, because social insurance is perhaps the safest source of financing for social protection, in the sense that is really within a very challenging fiscal and fiscal space conversation. It's an earmark funding that goes directly to social security with a very strong agreement by social contract for participation of both capital and labor in the financing of social protection. So giving away social insurance surely is something that should be considered very carefully. But clearly, your paper and others point us to the need to rethink, perhaps more deeply, how social insurance should change. And here I can only echo some of the points that other my colleagues have made, but perhaps add as a footnote that from the ILO we cannot say that any approach to changing social insurance, rethinking social insurance, should be really seen from the perspective of international standards and social security standards. So the broad principles of solidarity, extending mandatory coverage as opposed to voluntary coverage, and trying to avoid segmentation or reducing risk pooling, but broadening risk pooling in society. And really from this lens to see at what possible solutions can be. If something we have learned at the ILO is that tackling the issue of extending social insurance in the informal economy is really something that requires a multifaceted response. I mean, we need to take it from the design angle, look at issues of affordability, how to perhaps break the entry door to the system in a way that is more accessible for all without breaking solidarity. We know that it's a very steep first step into the ladder. Perhaps there are no intermediary steps. Some countries are going in that direction, but it's important to do it in a way that does not isolate more vulnerable workers for better of workers. And the second point is really what was mentioning, looking at attractiveness of benefits. How do we recognize needs better and respond to those needs through a better mix of short-term and long-term benefits? The third one is really an issue of better integrating contributory and tax financing. I mean, systems are still very much siloed. We have a social assistance tax finance sitting on one side, oftentimes in a separate line ministry, and we have social insurance schemes sitting somewhere else. This is really the time, and I think COVID has told us, to bring these two levers to work together to be much more integrated from a financing, from an institutional, also from an administrative standpoint. And finally, really to look at formalization as a much broader agenda. I mean, providing incentive to formalize, you've mentioned low levels of coverage, particularly among small, medium-sized enterprises, micro enterprises. It's a whole ecosystem that needs to change to provide incentive for formalization. Social protection is one of the factors, but you look at business registration, access to finance, taxation regimes, etc. So really moving towards developing more holistic, integrated formalization strategies within which social protection plays a role, but really within a more concerted effort is key. And final, rethinking administration. I think, my last point, rethinking administration. So looking more deeply at how not only awareness raising, but really behavioral change approaches can be used, can be adopted to convey the benefits of social protection in a way that can really be understood. Working on trust and accountability. Social security systems still enjoy relatively low trust. I mean, in some of the countries we work in, and digital technology transparency can make a big difference in really bringing more ease of engagement by especially more vulnerable workers. Final, really within the administration, to think about corporate identity. I've seen many social security institutions who have been built to serve the formal workers. It costs some sort of redefinition of the corporate identity of some of these institutions to really see themselves serving the needs of informal workers, agricultural workers, to really define, rethink in a way the client focus and redefine business processes from that angle. I mean, the good news is that there are positive examples in the region. You mentioned some. I want to mention Jordan with the Estidama ++ program, also Egypt with the move towards creation of new dedicated window for informal workers. Also looking maybe beyond Oman, who has recently taken a very aggressive and visionary reform to bring all social protection pillars under one integrated system. So it is time to rethink. It is time not to let go of social insurance, and social security standards still provide an important compass, but putting the needs of informal workers at the center is really what perhaps we should all be doing more, and your paper helps us in that sense. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. The topic is a very, very intricate one, and I think all three of our discussants made a fantastic job of it. Thank you, Alexei. Thank you, Luca. Thank you, Vladimir. So we now
could I maybe comment?
Sorry?
Could I comment to the? Yeah, can I comment to the discussions, or did you want to?
Now both of
but
you,
I'm just wondering.
like.
I'm just wondering how much time do we have just to?
I'm going to give you the time you need.
That is so sweet. Thank you. I am aware there's another session at 3:30, and I don't want to keep you from your coffee.
Very important topic. Please go ahead.
First, I would really like to thank Vladimir, Alexei, and Luca for the comments. I think they're very rich, and unfortunately will not be able to answer most of them. But if you also have, you mentioned that you had some comments as well for the statistical aspects of what we did. It would be really appreciated if you could communicate with us, or we're happy to follow up to improve the paper, because I think it is an important comparative paper for us to look at this de jure and de facto coverage, which started as looking at these laws and then using the data, and it kind of, as you guys also mentioned, it expanded into something larger, and we want to build on that. With that said, I think I want to pick a couple of the questions to address, and I would like to start with the question from Luca about why has it been different between the countries in terms of the de jure coverage and the laws that they have drafted. And here I would like to go back to the idea of context and the idea of civil society, the idea of tripartite discussion, the idea of how is the social contract conceptualized in these countries. Because at the end of the day, and this is a point that was brought both by Alexei and Vladimir, when we start to talk about the details of the system, as they say, the devil is in the details, and we can sit and argue whether social insurance is obsolete, while if it's the most important thing, or we should focus on health insurance, or social assistance is part of the problem. Different, priorities. This is a discussion that is ongoing, and I think that the debate is still up there. But what is very important to focus on, that we have to start with the concept of the social contract and the role of the country, the role of the state, the duty bearer, which we use in the human rights terminology. And also remembering that social protection, and if I go back to the ILO pillars of the social protection floor, it's about covering the vulnerable at the different points of vulnerability in their lives, whether this is childhood, or during work, or the after work, or also throughout with health coverage. So they're all very important aspects, and designing them, and here I go to the point that Alexei made, talk to the agencies. I completely agree with you. And I think one of the outputs of this paper that shows us that we actually have very good legal designs. We have these de jure, very nicely written laws. And then we come to the implementation, and that shows us this huge disconnect between what policy happens on the upper level, on what capacity and what we're able to do at the lower level. And you see this in a lot of the countries in the region. And a lot of times it's not, I mean, and I find it a bit problematic sometimes that we keep throwing this, there's no capacity on the ground. It's not that there is no capacity, there is capacity, but the capacity is so fragmented on conflicting priorities, macro instability, living continuously in this, like, this area does not have not seen sort of a calm period of rest in the past, in the recent history. So, and that is something we have to take into consideration. And maybe just one comment on the in terms of who are we looking at, and I really would like to address this, is that excluding the non-citizens. I think this is a very important point, that in a lot of times when we're talking to governments, and I think many of my colleagues who work directly with governments, depending on which government you're discussing, sometimes is addressed as this is also a national security issue because of the situation of the region, because of the number of, for example, refugees that could come in Jordan, for example. And we have a conflict here between human rights and national security. And this is something we cannot also be, we cannot forget that it is there. And at the end of the day, we are dealing with political considerations and political economy. From a human rights perspective, residents have to be included. That is what we call for. In reality, we see it differently. Are we able to push it as scholars and the international community from a human rights perspective? Definitely. From a governance perspective, it also depends. So I just wanted to throw that point out, that we explicitly
Zena, we don't have time to go into the political economy, okay?
No, I will stop here. I will stop here.
Listen to, okay?
I will stop here. It's just at the point of Luca. So I don't know if there are other questions, and maybe I give also the floor to Tamara if she wants to.
Yes, thank you, Zena. Firstly, I would like to also reiterate my thanks to all three commentators, Vladimir, Alexei, and Luca, for their in-depth comments. And indeed, as Zena said, we can't address all of them. We do not unfortunately have the time to go into that much depth. I briefly wanted to reflect on a point that was raised by Vladimir, because I think that is also important, is yes, you're absolutely right. Changes have taken place on the legal side. And this is something that we also struggled with in terms of, okay, how do we build our paper and how do we do the data analysis? Because at the same time, we're bound by the data analysis. So what we ended up doing was we mapped all the programs, but then we accounted for which groups were included through changes within the legal legislation at a later stage. And when we went into the data analysis, we accounted for those that were covered at that moment in time. So that was 2014 for Tunisia, 2016 for Jordan, and 2018 for Egypt, thus placing some of the changes that took place in Jordan and Egypt after the data. Having said that, another issue, and this is why we also argue in our paper, it's important to invest in data, is also to challenge, because Luca raised the issue of, but how come there is also this huge difference in terms of coverage, for example, in Tunisians? Now, it's not the full answer, but the part of the answer is also we couldn't account for all the different groups that we were able to find on the basis of the legal analysis within the data analysis as well. So this is a limitation within the data. And I think within the data, it is important that we invest further in it so that we collect data on the ground that is able to account for the different schemes, and maybe also who's able to access the different schemes. So whether they utilize the schemes at one point in time or not, because with that, it's also very challenging. We can only look at the comprehensive social insurance level, and we are unable at this stage, unfortunately, to really look at, okay, this many have access to the maternity, this many have accessed the unemployment insurance, for example, because also one of the challenges is, yes, indeed, you could be covered through past employment spells, but it depends on the number of contribution periods. And that is something that we're unable to state at this stage. So you need to look at it, at that story in the larger image. I hope I'm making somewhat sense in trying to answer some of the points or address some of the points that were also raised. But this gives hopefully a further insight. And also the issue of the nationality, this was also an issue that came up with the data, as it didn't allow us to really distinguish between the different types of nationality to the extent that we would have liked in the data. So therefore we chose also in part, together with what Sina already mentioned, to focus on the citizens at this stage.
Tamara, may I suggest that you may be in touch with these three fantastic guys who've given you so many very, very relevant, and I'm sure they wouldn't mind keeping up the conversation between you. That's, I've really enjoyed this session, and I'm sure there's
Great,
so much
thank you.
more that you can follow up with. Thank you. I think we have another session now, so we better move down.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, Dr. Heba. Thank you to our speakers and lead commentators. I'm always coming in with trying to cut time, and it seems to be going on. So I'm going to ask Professor Raghi Assad to be leading that final session. It's going to be an interactive session. So I would suggest that rather than going to coffee, grab your coffee back to your tables so we can give a full chance to enjoy the final session.
Hello, everyone. So we've had 2 very full days of discussion, very rich discussions, and I think we're all a little bit tired. So we're going to really try to be efficient in the session, have a fairly short final session by first eliciting some of your opinions, both those in the room and those online, about some very basic yes or no questions, where we will use the technology. There will be a QR code that you will be able to scan with your phone, and we will have you answer these yes or no questions. You'll see the results on the screen right away. We will then have a discussion. We thought initially that this discussion would be in the form of a debate, but in fact, we could have a discussion about how to respond to these questions and why. And then we will experiment to, after the discussion, ask you the questions again, the audience, and see if we get any change in your responses. So we will do this kind of experiment of whether the discussion is going to have an impact on your responses. So we'll start. Namis, are we ready with the? Okay, so here is the first barcode or QR code. So please use your phone to scan the QR code. And if you're online, please do the same. And once you get the question, please go ahead and answer it. Have people successfully been able to scan the question?
We all signed in? Yes? Yeah. Yeah, we would just want to make
Okay.
sure you're signed in first, and then the first question is gonna go.
Okay. So should social insurance be employer-based or universal? This is the issue of people who have formal jobs or have jobs. Should they be the ones to contribute, or should be a universal tax finance system, or at least is there a minimum universal benefit that should be tax financed? Okay, I see that at least we're still having some change in numbers. So we're starting with clear majority in favor of universal, which is quite dramatic change from what the current system is. All right. Do we have stability? So 73% say universal, and we'll see when we have the discussion. And I hope that among the people debating, there will be some who will argue both points of view. Next question. Should low-wage workers have government subsidized social insurance rates? Should the government contribute to the social insurance contributions of low-wage workers, or should it be completely funded through contributions? Okay. What? No, I mean, should there be partial subsidy or no subsidy? So the subsidized is partial subsidy. It's not full subsidy. And the not subsidized is that is that there shouldn't be a special subsidy for low-wage workers. Right. So far the answers are in favor of a more egalitarian, universal system, and that includes subsidies for low-wage workers to encourage them to be part of the system. Okay, could we have next one? Should there be a wage cap above which no additional social insurance contributions are due? So for instance, most systems right now have maximum insurable wage. Beyond that wage, the tax rate is zero. The payroll tax rate is zero. Should there be such a wage cap, or should you be contributing to all of your wages? That's a hard exam, yeah? Okay, so here we have more balance in the way people are responding to this. So we have about half thinking that there should be a cap on taxable wages, and about half that there should be no wage cap. The part of what the wage cap does is that or removing the wage cap would allow for cross-subsidization from high-wage workers to potentially low-wage workers. All right, let's move to the next one. Now, this is the other. Should there be a minimum taxable wage? This is the question that we were discussing, where if you have a minimum taxable wage, which is usually connected to the minimum wage, that could put a floor on the contributions to enroll workers, and that may make it less affordable for some very low wage workers. Okay, so again, a clear majority in favor of a minimum taxable wage. Now, of course, where you set that minimum taxable wage matters, and that could be part of what we were discussing. All right. Now, this is a question about new forms of work, and in particular with gig workers who are now working through platforms, electronic platforms, and should they be taxed through their platforms? So gig worker are people like Uber drivers or people who get work through an application on their phone or on their computer. Through the platform. So should the platforms be asked to contribute to the social insurance coverage of the workers who get work through that platform? Payroll tax. So this is social insurance tax. Yes, this is specifically about asking whether the gig workers should be taxed for their payroll tax or the social insurance tax.
And they're going to charge us this extra?
Of course. So it would be the same way as you're paying for a service, but then you would include the fact that the workers should be covered by social insurance, and the transmission of that should be through the platform. Okay, so clear majority saying yes, that the gig workers should be taxed through their platforms. Okay, one last question. Should the registration of small businesses be contingent on the social insurance coverage of the owner? So now this is about the formalization of micro and small businesses, and should they be required to cover the social insurance of the owner when they register their businesses. So this is about if the social insurance coverage of the owner should be a requirement when you come to register a business and make it more formal. So it could be the other way around too, but I think here the question is about, you want to go register a business, should at that point you be required to cover the owner's social insurance coverage? So again, we have a clear majority saying that the registration should be contingent on social insurance, keeping in mind that that may make the registration itself more costly, and therefore you would, but people feel that despite that, all of these questions have trade-offs attached to them. And so, but clearly there are answers, at least among you who've been here for 2 days and listened to all the discussions. So let's see if I ask, yes, we have our two discussants here, and then Ghada is online as well. Is Ghada Barsoum online? Okay, great. And so we will start with maybe the universalism question. So is social or the benefits from social insurance, retirement benefits, disability benefits, even health insurance, is this a right of citizens, and should a minimum amount be guaranteed to everybody irrespective of your employment status? Or is the current employer-based way of contributing to that and paying for that the way to go? And that's what we should try to expand and strengthen. So I'm going to ask you to comment on these two philosophical approaches first to how do you achieve a greater coverage of social insurance.
Okay, I'm going to start, because if I was a statistician, Raghi would have never asked me to be here, because I will say unpopular things. And the first unpopular thing I will say is that Raghi is a politician because you are framing the questions in a very leading way. It's because the world is not social insurance. Social insurance is not the only plate on your table. There is social assistance, there are different schemes. And I think that the question of universalism has been framed as something that is attractive and it's the right answer. But I think the only right answer is the system that you can administer. It's the system that you can implement. If you cannot implement universality, then even if it's the correct, morally correct answer, you can't. And you can't implement universality if you don't have a comprehensive and correct taxation system, because then you will not know if the benefits that you are giving and the deductions that you are making are fair or not. So I think that the best system is an integrated system, a system that mixes social assistance, social insurance, voluntary, mandatory, pay as you go along, a system that is appropriate for the history of your economy, the relationship between state and citizen. You cannot have an autocratic state that implements universality. It will be a populist situation. You will be stuck in a populist race to power, I think. So that is my answer. That I don't think it's neither only employer-based, but I don't think universalism in the way we talk about it as like this option that makes a lot of sense. It doesn't make any sense for Egypt. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. This was a very clear answer. We'll ask Asma to respond.
يمكن الإجابة لن تكون بعيدة عما قدمته السيدة. يعني الخيار ليس هو أن يكون معناها منظومة الضمان الاجتماعي مبنية على الامبلوير بيزد أو يونيفرسال، ولكن مهم جدا ربما اليونيفرسال لا تنطبق على عندما نتحدث عن السوشيال انشورنس الضمان الاجتماعي، فنحن نتحدث عن النظام المساهماتي. ربما عندما نتحدث عن نظام عالمي يونيفرسال بالعربية هو الشمولي، ربما لا يستجيب للكريتيريا أو لمقومات العمل المؤجر، ولكن يجب إعادة النظر في مقاربة الضمان الاجتماعي. لماذا؟ لأن هذه المقاربة أو كيف يحتسب الضمان الاجتماعي يحتسب على الأجور. فنحن نرى أن العديد مثلا من المؤسسات اليوم التي لا تخضع إلى الرقابة لا تقوم بتغطية أو بانخراط، لا تؤمن الانخراط لكل الأجراء بالنسبة إليها، وحتى إن تمت عملية الانخراط ب100%، فهناك عند دفع المساهمة تكون المساهمة غير لا تتوافق مع الأجور. فمثلا تجد بعض المؤجرين الأجراء بعد سنوات من الخدمة يتمتعون بالانخراط في الضمان الاجتماعي، ولكن لا يتمتعون بالبنشن، لأن المؤجر على مدى السنوات ربما دفع النسبة الأدنى التي لا تتماشى مع الأجر. يعني هنا يجب إعادة النظر في عملية الضمان الاجتماعي، كيف تحتسب الضمان الاجتماعي. وأنا أتذكر أن في سنة 2014 عندما تحدثنا عن إدماج العاملين في القطاع غير المهيكل، مثلا اليوتيكا نقابة رؤساء الأعمال قالت لماذا لا يعيد النظر في احتساب الضمان الاجتماعي وتكون مبنية على أرباح الشركات وليس على الأجور، لأن بالنسبة إليهم الضمان الاجتماعي يعتبر ثقل إنشاء سوسيال كبيرة جدا لا يستطيعون تحملها، ولذلك يجدون يعني على نسبة 100 عامل 50% فقط هم لهم انخراط وضمان اجتماعي تام. يونيفرسال أو شمولي ربما كما قالت السيدة integrated system يكون هناك حل، ولكن في كل الحالات employer based لا أظن أنه الحل المناسب اليوم، لأن الشركات بشكل عام هم في توجه إلى عدم انخراط تأمين انخراط العاملين مع ضعف مؤسسات الدولة خصوصا في مجال التفتيش أو تفقدية الشغل. يعني هذا بشكل عام موقفي من السؤال.
Okay, so do we have Ghada online? Ghada Barsoum.
Hi Ragi, hi everybody. I am sorry I could not make it in person. I have the benefit of talking after two very smart people. So I can only add very few points. So definitely it's not an and or. We talk about social protection, and social insurance is one tool of social protection. Social insurance is by definition employment based, it's contributions based. Universalism is a whole different debate. I think Hania made the right reference to what we know about this, because you cannot do universalism in a system where you don't know anything about the taxation, where you can't trust the taxation data. It's just not fair. You'll be repeating the universal subsidies that the system in the MENA region is gradually graduating from, because this is how it was. Subsidies were universal. Everybody was getting it, and we were all saying it's not fair because the rich are getting benefits similar to the poor. That being said, we know that conditional cash transfers, some of the major conditional cash transfers, we know that Oportunidades child coverage program, where every child is entitled for a basic minimum, because at the end of the day, social protection is meant to protect human dignity and investment in human capital. I see Rogi looking at the watch, so I think we've gone over time with this question, but thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Ghada. So we heard three clear and different opinions. I'd like to open it up to the floor just for this issue of philosophical approach to universalism based on citizenship right versus the existing system with some potential reforms and expansions. Is somebody in the floor willing to make, Irene? Or online? I mean, we could open it to people online. So please, somebody help me with the online.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I don't think it's and or, but I need to make the point that the successful stories in this kind of universal story of benefits, that universal should be too low to avoid any kind of disincentives that we don't want. So it's really a balance. So for any kind of cash transfer to be successful, or any kind of universal cash transfer to be successful, it has to be too low. And this is, by construction, is not social insurance. Social insurance has to be contribution-based. People contribute towards it, employer contribute towards it, and possibly we can think about subsidizing some of the employers. But then for the universal, this is a really different kind of paradigm. It's just kind of a really safety net, like a net, too low, just to help people passing the risk. That's it, but not kind of causing any disincentives.
Okay, so I'm hearing a sort of compromise emerging, which is we should have possibly a universal minimum, which is a safety net that everybody has access to, so that they're not destitute in their old age, and to some extent that's what the social assistance system is currently trying to do in many countries. But then if you want more than that universal floor or universal minimum, it has to be based on contributions over a lifetime. Yeah, okay. Could we hear from
Mr. Hazem Hassanin?
Yes, please, Mr. Hassanin.
Please be open, you, sir. I am glad to participate with you, and I want to speak in Arabic, please. خالص تحياتي لحضرتك دكتور راجي وللمنتدى الكريم وللقائمين على المؤتمر. لابد من النقطة الأولى التي أشير إليها في هذا المؤتمر، وهي أن وجود إطار عام شامل للحماية الاجتماعية لابد أن يسبقه وجود وحدة لسوق العمل. إذا أخذنا مصر مثالا سنجد أن مصر تتمتع بانقسام أو تجزؤ مفصلي في سوق العمل يقسمها إلى قرابة 6 أو 8 أسواق عمل، وبالتالي وجود إطار عام موحد للحماية الاجتماعية لابد أن يكون هدف لصانعي السياسات. يبدأ من توحيد طبيعة أسواق العمل، أو على الأقل اختزالها في سوق أو سوقين أو 3 أسواق على الأقل. أما بالنسبة للحديث عن وجود إطار عام واحد للحماية الاجتماعية دون التعرف على طبيعة وخصائص ومكونات هذه الأسواق الثمانية أو الست أسواق، والتي تنقسم إلى سوق عمل حكومي، وفي داخل هذا الحكومي أحدهم خدمة اجتماعية والآخر غير قادر للخدمة الاجتماعية، ثم سوق عمل خاص، ثم سوق عمل غير نظامي، ثم سوق عمل أجنبي. فهذه النقطة لابد أن أشير إليها في هذا الصدد، وشكرا جزيلا لحضراتكم لإتاحة هذه الفرصة.
Thank you very much for the contribution. But you seem to be linking again the idea of social protection to the labor market, and as specifically social protection linking to how we organize the labor market. And I think we have also talked about delinking that to some extent, and linking social protection to citizenship, not to necessarily your position in the market. But let's move on. And I'd like to kind of talk a little bit about some of the design features. Okay, sorry, go ahead, Pascal.
Yeah, just wanted to make one point about social protection. First, as a human right, and this is nothing new because it's in the Human Rights Convention from 1948. Yeah, so either through social insurance, social assistance, any other mechanism, we're talking about the realization of a human right. So we know we've been going through challenges to extend coverage. I think there was 10 years ago, in 2012, a compromise from all member states of the ILO on a social protection floor, which would combine the two dimensions of a floor, a basic floor, plus a progressive, let's say, progressive coverage with a vertical dimension mainly related to social insurance. So it's not one or the other, but we don't have one size fits all. Each state have to reinvent its own social protection system to reach this human right. We can look in the region. There are a very interesting example. Morocco now is moving towards universal social protection. Egypt is trying to achieve it in health. And in health, you have such an interesting example where you combine both contributory and non-contributory beneficiaries with a very interesting fiscal space for social protection. You have created new form of taxes, sin taxes, you know, like on tobacco, on eating cars, and so on. So each state has some opportunities to reach universal social protection, and maybe it's an opportunity to promote for a state-identified social protection floor.
Thank you very much for this comment, because it does indicate that some of the aspects of current social protection systems do combine this idea of universalism and rights-based approach with a more contributory-based social insurance system, and at least the Moroccan example and the Egypt health insurance example are examples of that. Currently, we do have a somewhat disjointed system where you have social assistance, which is need-based and targeted, and a social insurance system, which is employment-based. But there could be potentially a large group of people in the middle who neither have access to social assistance through the need-based targeted mechanism, nor do they have access to a formal job, a regular job with an employer in which they can contribute to social insurance. So I think that that space, that little missing middle, we need to think about creatively on how to cover that space. But let me move on to some of the more detailed questions we talked about. Is there a potential for having that mix between contributory and non-contributory that would be more continuous in nature, in the sense of government subsidies for low-income, low-wage people, going from almost complete subsidy for the social assistance form of coverage to phasing out the subsidy for higher wage workers. How do people, and I'd like maybe start with our discussants first, feel about a system which would be less binary in its design and would kind of have a relatively fluid movement from the non-contributory to the contributory? We could start with okay, start with Ghada. Ghada, are you ready to kind of respond to that?
Just 1 second. You want to have a system that's fluid between contributory and non-contributory? This is not very unclear to me, Rogi. Please come back. Please come again with this.
Yeah, I mean, the idea here is that we have currently a non-contributory system where the government subsidizes through tax revenue the entire amount of the benefit, and you have a system which is contributory, which is de facto government subsidized by the government filling in the deficits after the fact, once the system is not able to cover the entire benefits. But we're trying to think of a way of having government subsidies enter in a more continuous way so that you can bridge those two systems in some sense.
I don't think you can bridge the two systems, but I am a strong believer in the value of subsidizing social insurance, especially in a context like the Middle East, where you have a very large youth bulge. So I don't think you will need a huge subsidy, at least at this point in time, because this is a system that's designed as a pay-as-you-go system in terms of funding. So if the government is providing every possible incentive, even if it removes every possible barrier for people from the informal economy to join this system at the expense of making it seem not feasible. And we heard yesterday people from the Ministry of Social Solidarity who were talking about the importance of making it financially viable at this point. Yes, I agree on that, but increasing the contributions has really hurt us, as we have shown yesterday in the data. I am a very strong supporter that if you support a social insurance system and make it as inclusive as possible, you are basically saving money from social assistance. And you're playing the game of demographics because you have a large number of workers. And this is a system that's designed as a pay-as-you-go system. So subsidies now are actually investments. So I'm a very strong supporter of subsidizing social insurance systems. I know that this is not very popular among policymakers, but we really need to sit and make the math to show that with the game of demographics and with a large number of workers, any added person is actually an investment. Now, your point about making the difference between contributory and non-contributory systems fluid, I think it leads to a messy situation. Non-contributory systems should always be designed. I mean, we go back to the idea of should it be universal or should it be residualist or targeted. Social assistance, by definition, should be for people who are left behind. But social insurance should be as inclusive as possible. I hope I made myself clear. Thank you.
All right. Maybe we'll move to Asma this time.
يمكن هو السؤال صعب بعض الشيء، يعني لازم حتى الإجابة يجب أن نكون متمكنة جدا من
دور نتكلم على دور الحكومة في يعني ايه subsidies بالعربي في دعم
بالنسبة في دعم الأجور المتدنية في القطاع، يعني في القطاع المؤجر. هذا هو السؤال، في القطاع المؤجر. يعني سأعود إلى التجربة التونسية. ربما الدولة تساهم أو تدعم منظومة الحماية الاجتماعية، تأخذ على عاتقها نسبة من الحماية الاجتماعية بالنسبة للمؤجرين لدعم سياسات العمل. يعني هذا هو المعتمد، وليس معتمد أن تكون ربما أن تأخذ الدولة، أن تدعم الدولة الأجور الأدنى. ممكن أن تدعم المداخيل الأدنى في القطاع غير المؤجر، لأن هنا معناها الموضوع موضوع عدالة اجتماعية. يعني الشخص الذي له أجر أدنى، المساهمة هي مساهمة تخضع يعني بنسبة الأجر، هي مربوطة بالأجر، والخدمات أيضا مربوطة بالأجر، والبنشن بعد سنوات الخدمة مربوطة بالأجر. فإذا دعمت الدولة الأجور المتدنية، ماذا عن الأجور الأعلى؟ يعني من نظرة السوشيال جاستس لا أظن أنها أن الدولة تستطيع أن تتدخل في هذا المجال. والنقطة الثانية هي هل الدولة اليوم، الدول حتى العربية، هناك إشكالية في تمويل الصناديق الاجتماعية والبرامج الحماية الاجتماعية أو السوشيال أسيستنت. هل الدول اليوم تستطيع أن توفر تمويل مثل هذه البرامج لتتدخل لدعم حتى الأجور الأدنى؟ لا أظن أننا نستطيع اليوم أن ندعم مثل هذه المبادرة.
We have two opposing views. That's great for the debate. Now let's see what Hania has to say.
So the question is, should low-wage workers have government-subsidized social insurance rates? And for me, it's a clear no, because you're subsidizing the employer. And the more important question is, why are wages so low? What is the welfare function of this work that is being produced? In Egypt, the government pays itself a lot of money, because it provides the low wages, and it subsidizes the صندوق التأمينات العام, which, as you know, the government subsidy to the funds is 190 billion pounds, and it keeps growing, and it's grown by 80% in the past 10 years, as I was saying yesterday. So of course there is a problem with this subsidy regime for social insurance, and I think that the important question is, why are the wages low? Why is the welfare function of work so low? And is this the best thing for workers to do? Now, the more important question, I understand what Ghada is saying, but if you're talking about a youth bulge, the more important question is about part-time work, zero-hour work, lack of guaranteed hour work, whether in the gig economy or otherwise, and what should you do with that? And the approach to that is to further support the workers, and how. So the Netherlands, for example, when I was looking at, you know, they have the new law for part-time workers has the mix in the Netherlands now, since the law is about 70% part-time workers and 30% full-time workers. The landscape is changing completely, and low wages are not about poverty anymore. Low wages are about less hours worked or unguaranteed hours of work. So I don't think that the tool of subsidizing a low wage is the best tool for the time being if we don't understand the landscape. And the final point is to say, really, the hegemony of social protection over social insurance narratives is, I think it's important, but let's not forget productivity and the vibrancy of the economy and the growth and competitiveness. And these are things that I don't think we should occlude from this discussion, because we're talking about a social work contract, not social contract. So what is the social contract around work? A component of it is actually to encourage work, reward work, protect work, and make workers competitive.
This is a rare example where an anthropologist is sounding like an economist. So I would like maybe to open it up to the floor and the people online to just hear about that idea of to encourage inclusion of low-wage workers, as we saw yesterday, there's a lot of employers who are very much hesitant to cover their low-wage workers because of the high burden of the social insurance contributions. So should the government be providing subsidies for low-wage workers as a way of encouraging their inclusion into the system? And the question is then, how do you finance the subsidy? Where should it come from? So do we have people from the floor who are willing to throw in their hats? Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you for your point and about the government effectively subsidizing the employer instead. But the comparison to the Netherlands, I think for the case of Netherlands, if we compare it with the Middle East especially, I don't think something like part-time, the prevalence in the region would or can allow us to judge that the money would be misdirected just because the prevalence is much lower here. So when we're talking about low wage, it would probably actually target low wage workers, I think.
Okay, and I hear from Farah.
Thank you. So basically, I'm coming in now because I had a comment about subsidies earlier today, and I was asked about the alternatives, but I couldn't get the chance to respond. So basically, we have so many alternatives. Climate finance now can constitute a major alternative that can help us basically finance social spending in general if it is equitably, if it is done well, if it is done equitably. This is one. Solidarity financing and the concept that is adopted by the ILO, whereby basically the rich finance the poor, the healthy finance the sick, and so on and so forth. This is one of the alternatives. Financial decentralization in some contexts can be an alternative. I have so many alternatives here, but mainly, and what goes under solidarity financing are tax reforms. So the question was by Dr. Merwani, I remember, that if subsidies are exhausting our public budgets, so let's lift the subsidies and cash transfers can be much cheaper because otherwise we will have to increase taxes. Yes, we need to instead increase taxes, but this does not mean more taxes on the poor because we're not calling for more VAT, not even for sales taxes, although it is a bit better than VAT. We are calling what we don't have in the Arab region is basically corporate taxes. So what we don't have, we need to increase corporate taxes, personal income tax, wealth taxes, all kinds, the capital gain tax, the property tax, real estate gain tax, the Robin Hood tax, we don't have it. We have the multinational corporations that are basically free riding and evading, or living in their own tax haven. We have an export tax that we can use to finance social protection. We have mono tax, which we can use to basically replace the idea of formalizing the informal labor, because informal labor don't want to be formalized. This is not a legitimate, thing that we can do. So instead we can, as they are, just have them contribute with slight taxation without the fear of basically registering and contributing and paying a lot of taxes, and provide them with social protection in return, among others.
All right, so very strong position in favor of cross subsidies from other taxes and innovative ways to raise revenue for that. Iran.
I think we need to take some time and some perhaps rigorous analysis before coming to conclusion for this specific question. So recent evidence, I was trying to get the article. There was one article that I read that find that subsidizing the employers, firm employer part contributions towards the worker could lead to benefits in the short term, but not necessarily in the long term. So I think this matter needs some kind of longitudinal data to be sure that when we do that, when the government, seeing from the state, again, I like that pretty much from yesterday. When we recommend this to the government, we are sure that on the long term, the government won't regret it. And there will be no unintended consequences that we think. The second thing, why do we talk about government subsidizing the employer? Why not coming up with ideas like industries can do funds towards like risk management funds, but at the industry's level, each industry, like the app Hmini today, we heard about initiatives from the ground, but we also know from the work of WeGo that there are industries initiated funds to protect the most vulnerable worker in each sector. Now, this also poses challenges in terms of the idea of whether those industries will be equal. There will be equality, but then worth thinking about that before coming to a conclusion that, yes, we need to subsidize. No, we don't need to subsidize.
And these industry funds would be funded how?
From the firms. So okay. I think the biggest corporations.
Please. I just want to say that, of course, we've fallen into the trap of the Egyptian state being the state is everything and only things can come from the state, because intermediaries are very important in these vibrant markets. And it's not just from firms. I mean, there are, I was reading about the Black Cab in New York, which is a fund that is financed by 2.5 on each fee, and that fund is then people can register with them and get their protection from them. But then the question is about the state supporting this through taxation, through benign taxation practices. So I think that we don't talk about intermediaries enough, and maybe because in the research that we've heard about in the ELMPS, because it misses some of the professionals, where we already have that in Egypt. The unions, every professional union has a fund, which is actually where people derive the biggest chunk of their pensions. So I agree with Irene that it's worth talking about. In terms of the Netherlands and part-time, the problem is the low wage. Why are we such a low wage economy? And is it masked under employment? Are people if in fact you had a category of part-time work or some kind of guaranteed hour contracts, that you would discover that people have more time for themselves, or they can work as much as they want, or they can engage in part-time work. We just haven't legalized it, so we don't know if this would be an incentive or not.
So let me just add a little bit to that. I mean, the reality is that a labor market such as Egyptian labor market, for example, almost 50% of workers in the private sector who work for wages do not work for a regular employer. They are workers out of establishments, moving from one employer to the next based on the job. They're casual workers. So when we're talking about 50% of private sector workforce in that category, that's let alone those who are self-employed or who are moving between the self-employed and the casual labor categories in a fluid basis, and let alone then the workers who are informally employed with regular employers. So we have a labor market where that ability to impose a certain wage minima or contracts on employers or minimum hours of work or guaranteed that you're suggesting is almost non-existent for a good 3/4 of the private sector workforce. Those who work for the kind of employer who would be able to do that kind of thing is a very, very small fraction. And I think that's the reality of the labor market that we do have. So, so anyway, please, Alexei.
Intermediaries, and linked to the questions that we had on the survey. Actually, I like your pick on the fact that there is changing conditions in the labor market through expanding use of these platforms. So it's a gig work. It's a new emerging phenomena. Well, not new anymore, but expanding, I would say. And I think that that's the area that should be explored further, because what we see is that even where the government, first of all, it's the instrument to reach out through to some of the clusters of employment for the government agencies, and in some countries it's being explored. But again, with a different degree of political will and success. And it's a matter of debates whether these type of engagements should be classified as employer or not. But it's a matter of political decision. You have the captive audience, just start working with it. And unfortunately, in many countries, it's just somehow untouchables. And that is something that needs to be changed. Untouchables in the sense that this is not seen as potential contract that can be subject to a variety of the social insurance mandates as just like a regular contract. And so in this respect, where the government sometimes is lacking this confidence to reach out, the private sector is not shy. And what we see is that there's a variety of these embedded insurances that are offered through these platforms to the workers, starting with the accidental insurance. That's the first thing, which is also offered by the public agencies. But in this case, public agencies don't reach out. So there is a private sector. Here I am. Then variety of maternity, sickness, etc., health insurance. And so I think there's the whole emerging world of the intermediaries, and unions is part of it. In fact, in some of the countries, unions do actively cater to their members in terms of providing some of the benefits. So yes, unions, platforms, I think these are the type of policy innovations and IT innovations, I think that should be built upon. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are going to vote again. And so let's do that. It's going to take about 5 minutes to compile the results from the first vote and the second vote and look at that difference. So let's have you vote again, and then we will have a little bit of a discussion while the results are being compiled, and then we will end this. So, so please, Namis, can you put the... All right, here it comes. So we'll see how rigid or fluid our answers are. And you get to interpret how you want to put your third option among. It's hard to add that right now, so you'll have to choose. Yeah. Oh, so you started with the question. No, okay, here we go. That's the first question. That was your remnant from the last vote. Has everyone been able to? I think we do have a change. It doesn't look the same. So let's move. Okay, 50-50 now.
71.
So that that discussion did change some views. All right, everybody had a chance to vote. Let's move on. Next question. We reached some stability here. Let's move on to the next. this is potentially a source of the cross subsidy. If you want to subsidize low wage workers, one source of it is to not have a cap.
But could I say that this is how you resolve the insolvency of your social insurance fund? But on the other hand, you can assure solidarity through other taxation. So even if you have a cap, it's actually more equitable to increase your income tax, and then this non-taxable, you raise the bracket on the non-insurance taxed income, would create more funds, at least in Egypt. So social insurance is not the only source of solidarity.
Very good.
Is that these wages are being taxed to personal income. So there is a cap on tax. There's a maximum wage because they're going to be paying personal income on their whole wage. So that the system, the Bismarckian system, doesn't add more.
If you have a functioning income tax system.
Exactly.
All right. So, all right, let's move on to the next question. This is about the minimum taxable wage. And we saw this is a big issue. In the case of Egypt, there was a big increase in the minimum taxable wage in recent years, with potential effects on the coverage. Okay, well, let's vote on all the questions, because there's going to be a few minutes of compiling the results, and then I'm going to give you a chance to talk about it, okay? So, all right, let's move on. This is a pretty strong majority. And then this is the question about should gig workers be taxed through their platforms? It's like,
that's the question.
It'll be a contribution.
But then the question, we have to look at the end. Is it worth it? We have to make sure that the scheme would guarantee them pension or sickness or an maternity in times of need. So the question is at the end.
The idea would be that they will at least get benefits in proportion to their contributions, at least. Well, no, in this case, if they are going to be, they're going to be taxed through the platform. So if they're going to be participating in the platform, a certain part of their, what would have come to them in revenue will be directed to the Social Insurance Administration as a contribution. So it's not really voluntary. You can decide not to work through the platform, but if you work through the platform and get jobs through it, then you have to pay that tax. Yeah. Mike.
يمكن إجابة للسؤال اللي طرحته إيران. سأتحدث عن حوادث الشغل.
رد على آخر سؤال تاني علشان تلحق نميس الأجوبة وبعدين نرجع. Okay, can we just get the last one? Should business registration be contingent on social insurance? Okay, I think we now ask, okay, we have one more. So Namis to start compiling. We have, while she's doing that, we can start our conversation.
يعني تعقيبا على ملاحظة السيدة إيران، ما الذي سيتحصلون عليه الآن؟ على الأقل بالنسبة لحوادث الشغل. يعني الجيج ووركرز يتعرضون إلى حوادث شغل بحوادث طرقات خصوصا بصفة كبيرة جدا، و يعني عندما لا يتمتعون بالتغطية الصحية والتغطية الاجتماعية، خصوصا التغطية الصحية من المشغل اللي هي البلاتفورم المنصة، فهم يأخذون على عاتقهم هذه معناها تغطية حوادث الشغل. يعني يمكن أول بينيفيت هو التأمين على حوادث الشغل، وليس التفكير في بعد 10 سنوات البنشن أو الماترنتي ليف أو ما إلى ذلك، يعني لأنه القطاع هو قطاع حساس بعض الشيء، وحتى حتى بالنسبة للأمراض أيضا، يعني هم يتعرضون إلى أمراض كثيرة حتى في مدة عمل قصيرة جدا 6 أشهر، فهم يتعرضون إلى أمراض كثيرة ولا يتحصلون حتى على أي نوع من التأمين. فمهم جدا أن يكون هناك تأمين صحي بالنسبة للجيج ووركرز، وليس تأمين اجتماعي، على الأقل التأمين الصحي الذي هو part of the social protection.
Yes, I have one clarification point. So I actually meant it's very important that they pay for social insurance, but then we have to make sure that the legal framework enables them to disburse these pensions upon occupational injury, upon sickness, so upon short-term risks and long-term risks. Because, for instance, I'll quote the Egyptian legal framework. Unemployment insurance, by design, it's there. By practice, the conditions for having these unemployment insurance are very hard to get, and then there's no one getting unemployment insurance. So the difference between the theory and the practice, the theory should enable the practice to become true. So they have to have access, they have to trust that they can have these pensions in times of need, whether on the short term or on the long term. That's what we struggle with, at least in Egypt.
Please.
So what I think is really problematic is our positionality when we're answering these questions, because we have a middle class sort of statist discourse. I know it comes from a notion of the welfare state where the rich will help the poor and so on, but it's a very dated notion of how markets work and of social dynamics. And I think the breakthrough can be by regulating different sectors differently based on stakeholders and the clear notion of the most optimal role for the state. So the state may optimize its role by subsidizing in one place, regulating in another, applying the law in a third, being magnanimous in a fourth. That's one point. The other is that in answering these questions, we know that in our economies and our economic trajectories, these are often the same people. It's the same person who has not registered their business, is the same person who is a gig worker, is the same person who is a low-wage worker, is the same person that maybe has insurance in a formal sector job. So I think that it's difficult to make judgments or have opinions on what are not discrete categories. And sometimes they are, this is the wife, this is the husband, this is the son. So I think just thinking about these answers from a different positionality would be very helpful. Last thing is that when we talk about minimum wage and taxable minimum wage, I think the idea of a tax rebate for people who are poorly paid is the alternative to subsidizing social insurance payments. I mean, it's actually the same thing, but when you call it as a tax rebate, if you have a notion of a universal basic grant or a level, as Irene was saying, maybe it's low, but you are achieving it through different tools. But calling it a tax rebate and in that way fortifying your tax base and making it comprehensive delivers, I think, a better outcome than subsidizing
Can you be more specific about how the tax rebate would work?
So the tax rebate means that you have everyone is taxed, but some people, their income is so low that they're given money rather than money taken away from them. And in that way, of course, in Europe, where tax rebates are very are used. There are problems with the implementation, but the objective is to have a comprehensive and efficient taxation system. That's so important for social protection and for insurance.
But I thought you just earlier said that
not
since
to tax,
that's not possible, that's why you're against universalism.
Exactly. Well, for the time being, it's not. I don't think universalism is possible because we don't have that that tax base.
Okay, we are ready to see the results. So let's. All right, so we moved the needle against universalism. This discussion definitely moved the needle quite considerably in favor of a more kind of pragmatic employer-based system. On the government subsidy, we also moved the needle against what I think what Hania would call the bleeding heart position of, yes, subsidize. That's right. A populist just won the election. So a bit less than the movement of the needle on the other one. Okay, on this one, we moved the needle in favor of more egalitarianism and more cross-subsidy from the high-wage workers towards the low-wage workers by having more people not wanting to cap the taxable wage. Right. Next. Minimum taxable wage. Yes. Here it's, I would say, I don't know, a statistician would say probably the difference is not significant here. But at least a little bit more people in favor of a minimum taxable wage than before. And here we had a vast majority in favor, even bigger majority in favor of taxing workers through the platforms and using the platforms as a new technological way of collecting social insurance contributions. And the final one, we hadn't discussed that in our debate, so I'm not surprised that the positions are almost unchanged because we really didn't get to that in our discussion. So thank you so much for your participation and your engagement with this process. This has been really useful. I hope you enjoyed the process and seeing at least how views change as a result of good open debate. Thank you so much. Yasmin, you can come and close that off.
Hello. Thank you all very much for sticking around till the end. We've learned a lot over the past 2 days about social insurance and social protection in Egypt, Jordan, and Tunisia. And this event is the culmination of a 3 years project that was supported by the Ford Foundation, led by Dr. Rogi Asad, Dr. Karen Kraft, and Dr. Iran Silwanis. So I want to thank the principal investigators for their guidance and support throughout the process and the research teams. And I also want to say that all the papers and the policy briefs are on the website. We have only seen a third of what was produced because we couldn't fit all the research that was done over 3 years in like 2 days. So I invite you all to go to the ERF website and check all this effort, and I think you'll find it worthwhile. And I also want to thank Ford Foundation for their support to ERF, and I give the floor to Dr. Rogi.
So I also want to echo the thanks of you bearing with us for these 2 days with all these discussions. I think we learned a great deal, and I hope we advance the public debate about these issues. Again, this is not the end because we have lots of opportunities for further research on this topic. We have new data sets becoming available with the Egypt Labor Market Panel Survey currently in the field and will be ready within a few months. We have the Jordan Labor Market Panel Survey that is in planning and will be implemented next year. And they will include a number of very relevant questions about to look at the policy changes that have occurred in recent years and their impact and how effectively we have moved the needle in terms of getting a greater coverage, social protection coverage. So if you have suggestions for questions to ask, at least on the Jordan survey, there's still time for that. And to be able to have a more effective evidence base that we can use to look at these questions. In ending, I want to really give thanks to our ERF staff. I think this project from the very beginning was extremely well supported by an incredibly effective team on the ERF Secretariat, and they have really made this work very smooth, and it's almost where you don't have to worry about how things are administered, because you know people who are extremely competent are taking care of all the details. And you saw examples of that just now with Namis being able to produce results on the spot of your views on this issue. So thank you so much for the ERF staff and for all of you for joining us.
And a huge big thank you to Raghi. I have to tell you, it's always tricky having the closing statement done at an end of a project where there are a lot of people who have been working behind the scenes for good 3 years. I would say earlier, because I remember the early discussions that Raghi had with Ford Foundation then. So not to miss anybody, I think the teams at ERF, and I'm going to say teams without any separation, and the teams who are currently and who were previously there. And Raghi has a reputation of building, churning out teams all the time. So, you know, working with Raghi, it's a cycle that's really very inspirational and a lifetime way of learning. So on behalf of all of us, I really thank Raghi and his team and the leadership of the ERF teams, the programs, the communications, and also even the finance. So really grateful for each and everyone, and thanks again, and look forward to our next phases.